Her painting supplies sat exactly where she'd placed them. Easel facing the Paw Paw River, watercolors arranged by shade, brushes laid out with the precision of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Her car door hung open, keys still dangling from the ignition. A travel mug of tea rested beside her sketchpad, the liquid inside long gone cold. But the sketchpad was blank. 23-year-old Melissa Hargrove had come to this isolated pull-off in Bridgeton, Michigan on October 9, 2009, chasing what she called the golden hour, that fleeting moment when daylight surrenders to darkness. She was a watercolor artist who saw beauty in ordinary moments, who noticed what others overlooked. And then she vanished. For 15 years, this small town of 6,000 people would live with one agonizing question. What happened to Melissa Hargrove? No body, no witnesses, no answers, just an abandoned car, untouched supplies, and silence that stretched across a decade and a half. But before we uncover what really happened that October evening, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop your location and time in the comments below. And if you're into true crime stories that finally get solved, hit that subscribe button, because this case broke wide open in 2024. It was the second week of October 2009, and Bridgeton, Michigan had settled into that comfortable rhythm small towns know by heart. The sugar maples lining Main Street blazed crimson and gold. Front porches displayed carved pumpkins and corn stalks. The air carried that unmistakable crispness, promising winter wasn't far behind. Bridgeton was the kind of place where people still waved to strangers, where the local diner knew your regular order, where doors stayed unlocked because nothing bad ever happened here. Population just under 6,000. Berrien County, Southwest Michigan, safe, predictable, forgettable in the best possible way. Melissa Hargrove had lived in Bridgeton her entire adult life, having moved there after high school to pursue something most people thought impractical, making a living as an artist. Not just any artist. Melissa specialized in watercolor landscapes that captured Southwest Michigan in ways most residents had never quite noticed. She painted weathered barns against winter skies, the Paw Paw River winding through forests thick with white pine, old lighthouses standing guard over Lake Michigan. She worked part-time at Bridgeton Pharmacy to cover rent on her studio apartment above the shop. The job paid bills, but art was everything else. Her older brother David, who lived 90 miles north in Grand Rapids with his wife and 2 young kids, used to joke that Melissa had been born seeing the world differently. While other kids played tag at recess, she'd crouch by puddles, studying how clouds reflected in water. While teenagers obsessed over weekend plans, she filled sketchbooks with bark textures and leaf veins. Those who knew her described Melissa as gentle but intensely focused. She wasn't shy exactly, just contained, self-sufficient. She sent handwritten birthday cards. She remembered people's names. She showed up when she said she would. And when she talked about light, specifically that brief window at dusk she called the golden hour, her entire face changed. That fleeting moment when daylight gave way to darkness held something she couldn't capture any other way. She'd been working on a series dedicated entirely to that transition, chasing it across different seasons and landscapes. Friday, October 9th, 2009. Started ordinarily enough. Melissa woke early in her studio apartment, made coffee, spent the morning painting. She worked her afternoon shift at the pharmacy, helping customers pick up prescriptions, restocking shelves, making small talk with regulars who'd known her for years. Betty Kinsman, who owned the vintage clothing shop next door, saw Melissa lock up at 5 o'clock sharp. They waved to each other. Betty would later tell police that Melissa seemed perfectly normal that day, cheerful even. She'd mentioned being excited about a commission, painting landscapes for a doctor's office in nearby Benton Harbor. Security footage from the pharmacy's exterior camera, time-stamped 6:47 p.m., captured Melissa leaving through the side entrance. She wore jeans, a gray hoodie, and her favorite burgundy scarf, the one with embroidered autumn leaves her mother had given her 2 birthdays earlier. She carried her worn leather messenger bag and a stainless steel travel mug, probably filled with the herbal tea she drank constantly. She walked to her 2004 Subaru Outback, forest green with a dented rear bumper from a parking lot incident the previous winter, and drove away. Where was she headed? David would later tell investigators that Melissa had called him that afternoon, excited about scouting a new location along the Paw Paw River. She wanted to set up her easel right at dusk to capture the light filtering through the trees. She did this often, drove to remote spots, worked quickly while the light lasted, sometimes staying until full dark to see how shadows transformed the landscape. It was plain air painting, working outdoors directly from the subject rather than from photographs. David remembered asking if she'd be safe out there alone. She'd laughed. This was Bridgeton. Nothing ever happened in Bridgeton. But Melissa never came home. When she didn't show up for her pharmacy shift Saturday afternoon, her boss called several times. No answer. When she missed Saturday evening, Betty Kinsman climbed the stairs to Melissa's apartment and knocked. No response. She tried the door. Locked. She called David. By Saturday night, David had made the 90-mile drive from Grand Rapids. His stomach knotted with worry that felt both irrational and absolutely justified. He knew his sister. She was reliable. She answered her phone. She didn't just disappear. By 8 o'clock Saturday evening, he was sitting in the Berrien County Sheriff's Office, filing a missing person report. His voice steady, but his hands shaking as he filled out paperwork describing his little sister. Deputies located Melissa's Subaru Sunday morning, County Road 215, 7 miles northeast of downtown Bridgeton. An unmarked pull-off where the shoulder widened just enough for a vehicle to park. Dense state forest bordered one side, the Paw Paw River visible through the trees on the other. The car sat exactly as Melissa had left it, unlocked, keys hanging from the ignition, driver's door slightly ajar. Her messenger bag rested on the passenger seat. Inside, wallet, phone, a half-eaten granola bar, lip balm, a small watercolor set. Her painting supplies were arranged 15 feet from the vehicle, facing the river. Easel, larger watercolor palette, brushes lined up by size, a wooden stool she'd carried from the car. Everything was there. Everything except Melissa. The sketchpad clipped to her easel was completely blank. Not a single pencil mark. Not one brushstroke. As if she'd set everything up with her usual care, sat down to work, and vanished before putting pencil to paper. Search and rescue teams mobilized within hours. For 8 straight days, volunteers from 4 counties combed every inch of forest and riverbank. Cadaver dogs swept through underbrush so thick, volunteers came out scratched and bleeding. Michigan State Police helicopters conducted aerial searches, flying low enough that tree branches bent in the rotor wash. Divers checked the Paw Paw River, despite it being shallow, only 4 to 5 feet deep in most spots. More than 300 volunteers walked grid patterns until their voices went hoarse from calling Melissa's name. Churches organized vigils. Restaurants donated meals. Local businesses closed so employees could join search parties. David Hargrove, along with his parents, retired teachers who drove up from their home in Florida, held a press conference at the county courthouse steps. David stood at the microphone, exhausted and terrified, his 2 young children being cared for back in Grand Rapids by neighbors who didn't know what else to say. "Melissa is careful and responsible," he told the cameras, his voice cracking despite his best efforts. "She always tells people where she's going. She checks in. This isn't like her. Someone knows something. If you saw anything that Friday night, anything at all, please come forward." But after 8 days of searching, investigators had found nothing. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing snagged on branches, no footprints preserved under fallen logs. Heavy rain had moved through Saturday night and Sunday morning, turning the ground into mud and washing away whatever evidence might have existed. By the time searchers arrived, the forest looked untouched, as if Melissa had never been there at all. By late October, the active search scaled back. The case remained open, but leads had dried up completely. Detectives pursued every angle. Voluntary disappearance? Her life was in Bridgeton. Her art, her apartment, her work. Financial troubles? Bank accounts showed modest but stable finances. Romantic relationships? She'd been single for over a year with no concerning ex-partners. The case went cold, and Bridgeton learned to live with the absence of answers. 15 years is a long time to live with a question that has no answer. For David Hargrove, it meant 15 years of waking up wondering if today would be the day someone called with information. 15 years of checking his phone compulsively, afraid to miss a call from investigators. 15 years of watching his children grow up hearing stories about the aunt they barely remembered, the woman whose paintings still hung in their living room, whose absence shaped their family in ways they couldn't fully understand. David's parents, retired teachers living in Florida, aged in ways that had nothing to do with time. His mother stopped sleeping through the night. His father developed a habit of staring out windows, as if he might somehow see his daughter walking up a distant road, finally coming home. They marked every October 9th with a small memorial service in their backyard, lighting candles and sharing memories, holding on to hope that someday they'd know what happened. David himself became something most people never planned to be, an advocate for missing persons. He built a website dedicated to Melissa's case, updating it regularly with information, maintaining a timeline, keeping her story alive online when media attention faded. He called the Berrien County Sheriff's Office every few months, politely asking if there were any updates, any new leads, anything at all. The answer was always the same. "No, we're sorry. The case is still open. We haven't forgotten." But David knew how these things worked. Cold cases got colder. New crimes demanded attention. Resources went where they could do the most good. He didn't blame investigators. He just refused to let Melissa become another name in a database, another unsolved case gathering dust. Bridgeton carried Melissa's absence differently. The town had grown in 15 years. New businesses along Main Street, new families moving into old houses, new students filling classroom seats. But Melissa's disappearance remained part of the community's identity, a story everyone knew, a tragedy that refused to fade. People who'd never met her knew her name. Newcomers heard about the young artist who vanished while painting at sunset. Parents used her story as a cautious tale, a reminder that bad things could happen anywhere, even in towns where nothing bad ever happened. Every autumn, when the leaves turned brilliant shades of red and gold, when the light took on that particular quality just before dusk, people thought about Melissa. Local artists mentioned her as inspiration. The farmer's market, where she'd once sold paintings, displayed a small plaque in her honor. The pharmacy where she'd worked kept a framed photograph behind the counter. Melissa smiling, holding a paintbrush, her hands stained with color. The pull-off on County Road 215 became something between a memorial and a pilgrimage site. People left flowers there, especially in October. Bouquets would appear overnight. Wilting carnations, supermarket roses, wildflowers picked from nearby fields. Someone painted a small wooden sign that read, "Remember Melissa," and mounted it to a tree. Art students from nearby colleges visited, leaving their own paintings propped against tree trunks, tributes to a fellow artist they'd never known. Notes appeared, tucked into plastic bags to protect them from rain. "We haven't forgotten. Still hoping for answers. Your art mattered." Betty Kinsman, who'd waved goodbye to Melissa that final Friday, thought about her every time she climbed the stairs beside the pharmacy. Someone else lived in that apartment now, a young couple with a newborn, people who had no connection to what happened there. But Betty couldn't shake the memory. Sometimes she'd see the light on in the apartment window, and for just a split second, her heart would jump, thinking maybe Melissa had come back. Law enforcement had exhausted every reasonable possibility in those first months after Melissa vanished. Voluntary disappearance? Investigators found zero evidence she'd wanted to leave. Her art career was building momentum. She had close relationships with family. Her apartment showed no signs of planning a departure. Bills were current, rent was paid, food was in the refrigerator. People who voluntarily disappear usually leave subtle clues. Melissa left none. Financial troubles? Her bank accounts told a story of modest but stable living. She earned enough from the pharmacy and art sales to cover expenses with a little left over. No debt, no suspicious transactions, no large withdrawals before she vanished. Romantic entanglements? She'd been single for over a year. The ex-boyfriend was interviewed multiple times, had a solid alibi, showed genuine devastation at her disappearance. There were no dating app profiles, no secret relationships, no complicated love triangles. Melissa had been focused on her work, content with her life as it was. Foul play seemed obvious given the circumstances. Who leaves their car unlocked with keys in the ignition, supplies perfectly arranged, and simply walks away? But without a body, without witnesses, without physical evidence pointing to a suspect, the case stalled. It sat in filing cabinets and digital databases, periodically reviewed but never solved. The question tortured everyone who'd known her. What happened to Melissa Hargrove? Where did she go after setting up her easel? Did someone approach while she was alone? Did she see something she wasn't supposed to see? Did she struggle? Did she call for help in those dense woods where no one would hear? Or was it fast? One moment she was there, the next she was gone. No chance to fight back. No chance to leave clues. Not knowing was its own kind of hell. Worse than grief in some ways, because grief has shape and edges. Not knowing is formless. It seeps into everything. It makes closure impossible. For 15 years, Bridgeton lived with that formless dread. Cases like Melissa's are exactly why we can't give up on the missing. If you believe every person deserves to be found, hit that like button right now. And if you think forensic science is revolutionizing justice, stick around, because what happens next is incredible. Then, in spring 2024, everything changed. March 2024. Detective Rachel Voss sat in her office at the Berrien County Sheriff's Department, surrounded by file boxes that smelled like old paper and stale air. She joined the cold case unit 3 years earlier after spending nearly a decade working patrol and major crimes. Back in October 2009, she'd been a rookie deputy, fresh out of the academy, still learning the geography of the county she'd sworn to protect. She remembered the Melissa Hargrove case vividly, remembered the massive search effort, the press conferences, the community vigils, remembered the way hope slowly drained from people's faces as days turned into weeks with no discoveries. When Voss joined the cold case unit in 2021, Melissa's file was one of the first she requested. Something about it felt incomplete, like a puzzle with a missing piece that everyone had overlooked. For 3 years, she'd periodically pulled that file, reading through reports she'd practically memorized, witness statements, search grid maps, evidence logs, photographs of the abandoned car, the arranged painting supplies, the blank sketchpad. And then there was the blood, microscopic droplets, barely visible to the naked eye, found on the driver's side door handle during the initial forensic processing in 2009. The lab had extracted DNA and confirmed it didn't belong to Melissa. That unknown profile was immediately entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database that cross-references DNA from crime scenes with known offenders. No matches came back. Whoever left that blood had no criminal record requiring DNA submission. The profile sat in the system for 15 years, essentially useless, waiting for a match that never materialized. But Detective Voss knew the landscape of forensic science had shifted dramatically since 2009. Forensic genetic genealogy had emerged as a revolutionary investigative tool, the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018 after decades of mystery. The method didn't rely on matching crime scene DNA to criminal databases. Instead, it uploaded DNA profiles to public genealogy websites where ordinary people had submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry and family history. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Everyone shares DNA with relatives. Third cousins, fourth cousins, distant branches of family trees most people don't even know exist. By identifying these distant genetic relatives and building comprehensive family trees backward to common ancestors, investigators could trace lines forward through generations to identify potential suspects. Voss consulted with Sergeant Marcus Blake at the Michigan State Police Crime Lab in Grand Rapids. Together, they reviewed the DNA evidence from Melissa's case. The sample was degraded after 15 years in storage, but modern extraction techniques could work with remarkably small amounts of genetic material. In April 2024, the DNA profile was converted into a format compatible with genealogical databases and uploaded to GED Match Pro, the law enforcement version of the public site. Within hours, the system identified multiple genetic matches, people who shared DNA segments with the unknown individual whose blood had been found on Melissa's car door. This was just the beginning of what would become an intensive 3-month investigation. Detective Voss reached out to Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, whose cold case program had already helped solve several Michigan homicides using forensic genetic genealogy. The program paired criminal justice students with real cases under the supervision of Dr. Patricia Brennan. a former FBI behavioral analyst who now taught forensic investigation. 3 graduate students volunteered for the Hargrove case: Jordan Martinez, Alicia Patel, and Marcus Freeman. They worked out of a secure facility on campus, supervised by Dr. Brennan and in constant communication with Detective Voss. The work was painstaking and incredibly time-consuming. They started with the genetic matches identified through GED match. 3rd cousins, 4th cousins, 5th cousins, people scattered across the country who'd uploaded their DNA, hoping to learn about their ethnic background or find distant relatives. These individuals had no idea they'd become crucial to solving a 15-year-old murder case in a small Michigan town most had never heard of. The students worked methodically, building family trees that spanned multiple generations. They used census records dating back to the 1800s, obituaries, birth and death certificates, marriage records, military service documents, immigration records, social media profiles, Ancestry.com subscriptions, family search databases. Every available genealogical resource became part of their toolkit. Week by week, the trees grew. Common ancestors emerged. Great-great-grandparents who'd lived in Michigan and Indiana in the late 1800s and early 1900s. From those common ancestors, the students traced every descendant line forward through time, creating massive charts that covered the walls of their workspace. Every marriage produced new branches. Every child represented a new line to follow. Some branches ended in childhood deaths, recorded in old cemetery records. Others stretched forward through multiple generations, expanding into dozens or even hundreds of living descendants. The elimination process was systematic and ruthless. Women were excluded. Melissa's size and strength suggested her attacker was likely male. People who were too young or too old in October 2009 were eliminated. Those who died before Melissa disappeared were crossed off. Individuals who'd been incarcerated at the time were ruled out. People living out of state with no connection to Michigan were removed from consideration. After 2 months of exhaustive work, late nights, weekends, hundreds of hours of research, the students and Detective Voss had narrowed their focus to 6 possible individuals who matched all preliminary criteria. Further background checks refined the list: employment records, geographic history, traffic violations, property ownership, marriages and divorces. Each detail helped eliminate possibilities until one name stood out with startling clarity: Nathan Paul Driscoll. When Detective Voss pulled his file and began reading through his history, every instinct she'd developed over 15 years in law enforcement started firing. Nathan Driscoll was 57 years old in 2024. In October 2009, when Melissa vanished, he'd been 42 years old, living in Watervliet, Michigan, a small town just 12 miles from Bridgeton. Not a neighbor exactly, but close enough to know the area intimately. His employment history was revealing. Driscoll had worked as a maintenance technician for the Van Buren County Road Commission, which meant he knew every back road, every unmarked pull-off, every isolated spot in the region. It was literally his job to know where the remote places were. County Road 215, where Melissa's car was found, fell directly within his work territory. His personal history was troubling. Divorced twice, with both ex-wives having filed restraining orders citing controlling and aggressive behavior. Court documents described a pattern: initially charming, then gradually isolating, then explosively angry when challenged. One ex-wife mentioned him following her to work. Another described him showing up at her house unannounced, refusing to accept that the relationship had ended. In 2006, Driscoll had been arrested for aggravated assault after a bar fight in Benton Harbor. He'd put another man in the hospital with facial fractures. The charges were eventually reduced to simple assault, resulting in probation and anger management classes he'd completed without incident. But here was the detail that made Voss's pulse quicken. Nathan Driscoll had abruptly quit his job with the Road Commission in late October 2009, less than 2 weeks after Melissa disappeared. He'd given no notice, simply called in saying he was done, collected his final paycheck, and left. By November 2009, he'd moved to northern Michigan, where property records and sparse employment history showed he'd lived off the grid for several years before finally settling in Petoskey around 2015. Why would someone quit a stable government job with benefits without notice? Why would someone leave the area right after a woman vanished from a location within his work territory? Detective Voss knew having a name wasn't enough. She needed confirmation. She needed proof that Nathan Driscoll's DNA matched the blood on Melissa's car door. In early July 2024, Voss coordinated surveillance on Driscoll at his current residence in Petoskey, a modest rental house on the outskirts of town, 240 miles north of where Melissa had vanished. On July 9th, investigators obtained a discarded coffee cup from a trash receptacle outside the fast food restaurant where Driscoll regularly ate lunch. The cup was immediately transported to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab for DNA extraction and analysis. The wait felt eternal. 5 days passed. Voss tried to stay focused on other work, but her mind kept circling back to the Hargrove case. After 15 years, after 3 months of intensive genealogical research, after countless hours by dedicated students, everything came down to what that coffee cup would reveal. On July 15, 2024, Sergeant Blake called Detective Voss with results that would finally bring answers to a family who'd waited far too long. The DNA from the discarded coffee cup was a definitive match to the blood found on Melissa Hargrove's car door handle 15 years earlier. Statistical probability, 1 in 8.7 trillion. It was Nathan Paul Driscoll's blood. He had been there. He had touched that car. Whatever happened to Melissa that October evening, Nathan Driscoll was involved. On the morning of July 18, 2024, Michigan State Police troopers and Berrien County detectives executed an arrest warrant at Nathan Driscoll's rental house in Petoskey. It was early, just after 6 a.m., and Driscoll answered the door in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, looking older than his 57 years. When Detective Voss identified herself and informed him he was under arrest for the murder of Melissa Hargrove, Driscoll's face remained expressionless for several long seconds. Then he closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and held out his wrists for handcuffs. He said nothing, not a word of protest, not a claim of innocence, just silent acceptance, as if he'd been waiting 15 years for this exact moment. Over 3 days in late July 2024, Detective Rachel Voss sat across a metal table from Nathan Paul Driscoll in an interview room at the Berrien County Sheriff's Department. The sessions were recorded, video and audio, with his attorney present. Driscoll had waived his right to remain silent. He wanted to talk, he said. He was tired of carrying it. His voice throughout those interviews was flat, emotionless. He spoke as if describing someone else's actions, as if the events of October 9, 2009 had happened to a different person in a different life. He showed no tears, no remorse, no emotional reaction at all. Just a monotone recitation of facts delivered with the same inflection someone might use to describe their morning commute. This is what Nathan Driscoll told investigators. October 9th, 2009, Friday evening. He'd been finishing a late maintenance shift, repairing damaged guardrails on County Road 142. Around 7 o'clock, darkness closing in fast, he'd packed his tools and started driving back toward the road commission yard to drop off his work truck. He took County Road 215, a route he drove constantly, knew every curve and straight away. That's when he noticed the forest green Subaru Outback parked at the pulloff. According to Driscoll, he was curious. Vehicles didn't park there often, especially not at dusk. He wondered if someone needed help. Flat tire, mechanical trouble, something like that. So he pulled over, parking behind the Subaru. That's when he saw her. A young woman, petite, dark hair pulled back, wearing jeans and a gray hoodie with a burgundy scarf. She was carrying supplies from her car toward the tree line: easel, painting materials, a wooden stool. Setting up to paint, apparently, even though the light was nearly gone. Driscoll claimed he approached simply to talk. He was lonely, he said, divorced recently, living alone, working long hours on empty roads. He just wanted conversation, human connection. That's the story he told Detective Voss, his face blank, his hands folded on the table. But here's what Melissa would have experienced in those moments. A stranger, a man significantly larger than her, approaching in an isolated location as darkness fell. No other cars, no witnesses, dense forest on all sides. The nearest house more than a mile away. Driscoll said he called out a greeting, tried to be friendly. Melissa turned, startled. According to his account, she smiled politely, but told him she was fine, didn't need help, wanted to be left alone to work. He didn't leave. He kept talking, he said, asking about her painting, commenting on the location, telling her it wasn't safe to be out here alone. She should be more careful. A young woman like her shouldn't be in isolated places. The language itself was a warning sign, controlling, possessive phrasing disguised as concern. Both of Driscoll's ex-wives had described this exact pattern. Statements that sounded protective, but were actually about control. Melissa's fear would have been escalating. This stranger wouldn't leave when asked. He was blocking her path back to the car. The sun had set. Shadows pooled under trees. She was alone. She told him again to leave. Firmer this time. He didn't. She started backing toward her car, eyes locked on him, trying to keep distance between them. He followed, closing the gap. Still talking in that calm voice about how dangerous it was for young women to be alone, how she should be grateful he stopped, how other men might not have good intentions. Melissa reached for her phone. That's when he grabbed her wrist. She fought. Detective Voss's reports from the interviews described this next part in Driscoll's own words, delivered in that same flat monotone. Melissa scratched at his face, drew blood, tried to twist free. She was strong for her size, determined, terrified. She kicked, clawed, screamed into the empty woods where no one could hear. Driscoll was 6 feet tall, 200 pounds. Melissa was 5'4", maybe 120 pounds. The outcome was inevitable. According to his confession, he struck her, once, hard, across the face. She stumbled backward, lost her footing on the uneven ground, thick with fallen leaves. She fell. Her head struck a large rock hidden beneath the autumn debris. Driscoll knelt beside her, checked for a pulse. Nothing. He said he panicked, said it was an accident, said he never intended to kill her, only wanted to talk. But evidence recovered during the investigation tells a different story. Text messages from Driscoll's phone in the days before Melissa disappeared showed escalating frustration. Messages to a friend complaining about women rejecting him, about how women didn't appreciate nice guys, about how they'd rather be alone than give someone a chance. Surveillance footage from multiple locations in downtown Bridgeton revealed something more disturbing. Driscoll's personal vehicle, a dark blue Ford F-150, had driven past the pharmacy where Melissa worked at least twice in the week before she vanished. Once on Wednesday evening, once on Thursday afternoon, both times during hours when she would have been working. Was her death truly an accident? Or had Nathan Driscoll been watching her, following her, waiting for an opportunity when she'd be isolated and vulnerable? Regardless of his intentions, what he did next eliminated any claim to accidental death. Driscoll dragged Melissa's body deeper into the woods, away from the pulloff, away from the river trail where searchers would eventually walk. He found a steep ravine about 300 yards from where she'd fallen, a natural depression thick with undergrowth, difficult to access, the kind of place hikers avoided because the terrain was treacherous. He buried her there. Shallow grave, not deep. Covered the disturbed earth with leaves, branches, deadfall, forest debris that made the site blend seamlessly with surrounding landscape. The rain that moved through that weekend, heavy, sustained, further concealed what he'd done, washing away disturbed soil, settling the leaves, making the gravesite virtually invisible. He kept her scarf, the burgundy one with embroidered autumn leaves. Back at the pull-off, he wiped down what he could, tried to remove signs of struggle. Blood from the scratches on his face had transferred to her car door handle when he'd braced himself while dragging her away. He didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't realize the significance. For 2 weeks, Nathan Driscoll showed up to work, completed maintenance assignments, spoke to co-workers, acted normal. Then, late October, he quit without explanation and moved north, eventually settling in Petoskey, where he lived in near isolation for years. In one of the recorded interviews, Detective Voss asked about the scarf. Why keep it? Why not dispose of evidence? Driscoll stared at the table for a long time before answering. I kept it in a box, he said, voice still flat. Storage unit first, then my closet after I moved. I'd look at it sometimes. I knew it was wrong. I knew I should get rid of it. But I couldn't. It was proof she'd been real. That it happened. Detective Voss asked the obvious question. How much of his story was true? Was Melissa's death truly an accident, or had he intended violence from the moment he approached her? Driscoll never answered that question directly. His story remained consistent across all 3 days of interviews. An accident, he claimed. A tragedy he never meant to happen. But his actions afterward told a different story. Concealment, deception, 15 years of silence while a family suffered. July 22nd, 2024. 4 days after Nathan Driscoll's arrest, a forensic recovery team assembled at the coordinates he'd provided during his confession. The location was approximately 300 yards northeast of the county road 215 pull-off, where Melissa's car had been found 15 years earlier, deep in state forest that most people never ventured into. Dr. Ellen Kowalski, a forensic anthropologist from Michigan State University, led the recovery operation. She'd worked dozens of cases like this, remains buried for years, degraded by time and elements, requiring meticulous excavation to preserve whatever evidence remained. Her team included forensic technicians, evidence photographers, and 2 cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains, even after decades of decomposition. The site was marked off with crime scene tape. A canopy tent was erected to protect the excavation area from weather. Generator-powered lights were positioned around the perimeter because the forest canopy blocked most natural light, even during daytime hours. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed first, scanning the area Driscoll had described. A steep ravine, thick with undergrowth, the terrain sloping sharply toward a seasonal creek that only held water during heavy rain. The radar showed a subsurface anomaly consistent with disturbed soil, approximately 2 feet below the current ground level. The cadaver dogs confirmed it. Both animals alerted at the exact same spot, sitting and staring, the trained behavior indicating human remains detected. Excavation began on the morning of July 23rd. This wasn't the rapid digging most people imagine when they think of recovering buried remains. Dr. Kowalski and her team worked in thin layers, removing soil centimeter by centimeter, photographing every stage of the process. Every handful of dirt was sifted through fine mesh screens to capture small bone fragments, teeth, personal items, anything that might have evidentiated significance or helped confirm identity. The work was slow, painstaking, exhausting both physically and emotionally. David Hargrove had been notified that recovery efforts were underway. He waited in Bridgeton with his parents, his phone clutched in his hand, preparing himself for news that would finally end 15 years of not knowing. Detective Voss had warned him the confirmation process might take time. Dental records, forensic analysis, official identification protocols, but she'd also told him to prepare for the worst. By the afternoon of July 24th, the excavation had revealed what everyone feared and expected: skeletal remains, positioned in a shallow grave exactly as Driscoll had described. The body had been placed on its side in a fetal position, likely to fit the narrow space. 15 years of decomposition, insect activity, root growth, and seasonal weather had reduced soft tissue to almost nothing. But bones tell stories. Dr. Kowalski documented everything: the position of the remains, evidence of perimortem trauma, injury occurring at or near the time of death, a depressed fracture on the back of the skull, consistent with impact against a hard object, broken hyoid bone, suggesting possible strangulation or neck trauma, defensive fractures on the left ulna and radius, forearm bones broken while trying to ward off an attack. Melissa had fought. The bones proved it. Among the remains, forensic technicians recovered fragments of gray fabric, the hoodie she'd been wearing. The material was heavily degraded, stained with soil, barely recognizable. But there were also items that had survived better: a silver bracelet, tarnished but intact, small hoop earrings, a watch with a leather band that had rotted away, leaving only the metal face and mechanism. Detective Voss photographed the bracelet and sent the image to David Hargrove, asking if he could identify it. His response came within minutes. "That's hers. I gave it to her for her 21st birthday. It has a small engraving on the inside. Paint the world, M. That's Melissa." The engraving was still visible, etched into metal that had survived what flesh and fabric could not. On July 26th, dental records obtained from Melissa's dentist in 2009 were compared to the skull recovered from the gravesite. Dr. Raymond Chen, a forensic odontologist, performed the comparison. Dental records are as unique as fingerprints. The pattern of fillings, root canals, tooth positioning, Previous dental work creates an identifier that doesn't change after death. The match was definitive. The remains recovered from the forest ravine were Melissa Hargrove. After 15 years, her family had an answer. Not the one they'd hoped for during all those years of waiting. Not the miracle where she walked through the door, alive and safe, with an explanation for where she'd been. But closure, certainty, an end to the terrible limbo of not knowing. Melissa was coming home. The arrest of Nathan Paul Driscoll sent shockwaves through two communities separated by 240 miles, but now connected by tragedy. In Bridgeton, the reaction was complex, relief mixed with renewed grief. For 15 years, people had wondered, speculated, hoped against hope that somehow Melissa had survived, that maybe she'd lost her memory, or chosen to disappear, or been held captive and would eventually escape. Those fragile possibilities, however unlikely, had kept hope alive in some small corner of the collective consciousness. Now there was certainty. Melissa hadn't survived. She'd been murdered that October evening, buried in the woods she'd loved to paint, her life stolen by a stranger who saw her isolation as opportunity. Vigils were held. The pull-off on County Road 215, already a memorial site, was visited by hundreds in the days after the announcement. Fresh flowers covered the ground. Candles flickered in glass holders. New paintings appeared, propped against trees, tributes from artists who understood what Melissa had been chasing when she came here that final time. Handwritten notes multiplied, messages of love and remembrance and gratitude that justice had finally arrived. Betty Kinsman, now in her 70s, spoke to local reporters gathered outside the pharmacy where Melissa had worked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "I've thought about her every October for 15 years, Betty said. Every time the leaves turn, every time the light gets that golden quality right before sunset. I'd wonder where she was, if she was cold, if she was scared, if she knew we were looking. Now we know. It doesn't make it better, exactly, but it makes it real. We can stop wondering and start grieving properly." In Petoskey, 240 miles north, the reaction was different. Shock, disbelief, fear. Nathan Driscoll had been a neighbor, a regular at local businesses, someone people had passed on the street without a second thought. He lived quietly, kept to himself, never caused problems. The revelation that he'd been living with this secret for 15 years unsettled the entire town. "You never know who's living next door," one resident told news cameras. "He seemed completely normal. That's the terrifying part." The case ignited broader public discussion about forensic genetic genealogy, the technique that had finally identified Driscoll after 15 years. Privacy advocates raised concerns about law enforcement accessing genetic databases built by ordinary citizens trying to learn about their ancestry. Should people who innocently submitted DNA to trace their family history have that information used to investigate their distant relatives? But for Melissa's family and for law enforcement agencies nationwide dealing with thousands of unsolved cold cases, the technique was nothing short of miraculous. DNA that had sat useless in databases for decades could now generate leads. Families who'd given up hope could get answers. Killers who'd escaped justice for years or even decades could finally be held accountable. Detective Voss, speaking at a press conference, addressed the privacy concerns directly. "Every technique we use must balance individual rights with public safety. But when someone commits murder and leaves their DNA at the scene, they forfeit certain expectations of privacy. Forensic genetic genealogy doesn't violate the privacy of innocent people. It uses publicly available information to identify suspects, who are then confirmed through traditional DNA testing. It's no different from using a witness description to identify a suspect, except more accurate. For David Hargrove, now 45 years old and father to teenagers who'd grown up hearing stories about an aunt they barely remembered, the breakthrough felt surreal. He released a statement in early August that was read at multiple vigils and published in newspapers across Michigan. His words, carefully chosen and deeply felt, captured what 15 years of not knowing had cost. For 15 years, my family has lived with a hole in our lives. Not just Melissa's absence, but the torture of not knowing what happened to her. Was she alive somewhere? Was she suffering? Did she think about us? Did she want to come home but couldn't? The questions never stopped. They followed us through every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Tuesday morning. You can't grieve properly when you don't have answers. You exist in this terrible limbo where you can't move forward, but you can't go back. Now we know it's not the answer we prayed for. We wanted her to walk through the door, alive and safe, with an explanation that made sense. But we can finally grieve properly. We can remember Melissa without the question mark. We can tell her story with an ending, however painful. I want to thank Detective Rachel Voss, who never gave up on my sister, Sergeant Marcus Blake at the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, the students at Western Michigan University, Jordan Martinez, Alicia Patel, Marcus Freeman, who spent 3 months building family trees to find the man responsible, Dr. Ellen Kowalski and her team who brought Melissa home with dignity and respect, and everyone in Bridgeton who kept her memory alive for 15 years. Melissa was talented and kind. She saw beauty in ordinary things. She deserved a long life filled with art and love and golden hour light. Nathan Driscoll took that from her. He took her future. He took 15 years from our family. But he didn't take her memory. That's ours. That's forever. And now, finally, he'll face justice. That justice came on September 12th, 2024, in a courtroom packed with Melissa's family, friends, community members, and law enforcement who'd worked the case. Nathan Paul Driscoll entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder and concealment of death. The plea agreement spared Melissa's family the ordeal of a trial. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. Driscoll offered a brief apology during sentencing. 3 sentences delivered in that same flat, emotionless tone he'd used during his confession. "I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I accept my punishment." The words rang hollow in that courtroom, performative rather than genuine. When the sentence was pronounced, a collective exhale moved through the room. Not celebration exactly, but release. Closure. 15 years of waiting finally over. Justice took 15 years to arrive, but it arrived. What do you think about forensic genetic genealogy solving cold cases? Should privacy concerns limit its use, or is justice for victims more important? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. October 9th, 2024. Exactly 15 years to the day after Melissa Hargrove vanished while chasing golden hour light, more than 500 people gathered at Riverside Park in Bridgeton to remember her. Not as a victim, not as a cold case statistic, but as the artist, daughter, sister, and friend she'd been before Nathan Driscoll stole her future. The memorial service began at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the same time Melissa had closed the pharmacy that final Friday. The timing was intentional. David Hargrove, who'd spent months planning this gathering with his parents and community members, wanted to honor the light his sister had loved so deeply. Musicians played quietly, acoustic guitar, violin, simple melodies that drifted across the park where families sat on blankets and folding chairs. Children who hadn't been born when Melissa disappeared played near the river's edge, their laughter a reminder that life continues even after tragedy. David stood before the gathered crowd as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. He wore a tie printed with tiny paintbrushes, a gift from his teenage daughter, who'd never met the aunt, but felt she knew her through stories and paintings that still hung in their home. His voice was steady as he spoke about Melissa's artistic legacy, about the watercolor paintings that captured Southwest Michigan in ways residents had never quite noticed before, about her belief that art's purpose was to show people the beauty they overlooked, about the sketchbooks filled with observations, light filtering through leaves, reflections and puddles, the way frost formed patterns on windows. She saw the world differently, David said, and she spent her life trying to share that vision with everyone else. That's what artists do. They notice. They preserve moments. They say, "Look, this matters. This is beautiful. Pay attention." He announced that a portion of Melissa's art would be donated to the Bridgeton Public Library, where community members could experience her work. The rest would be preserved by the family, eventually passed down to his children, a legacy of beauty created by an aunt they'd love forever, despite never having the chance to know her. As the sun descended, that golden hour Melissa had chased with such dedication, attendees were invited to light candles. Hundreds of small flames flickered to life as darkness gathered. The effect was breathtaking. Tiny points of light held by people who'd loved Melissa, who'd searched for her, who'd refused to forget. Near the park entrance, a permanent memorial bench had been installed earlier that week. Bronze plaque affixed to dark wood, engraved with words from Melissa's journal that David had discovered while going through her belongings years ago. Art is noticing what others overlook and showing them it was beautiful all along. Melissa Hargrove. The bench faced west, positioned to catch the sunset. A place for contemplation, for remembering, for noticing beauty the way Melissa had taught people to do. The pulloff on County Road 215, 7 miles from where this memorial service unfolded, would remain a place people visited, but it was no longer a place of unanswered questions, no longer haunted by the terrible mystery of what happened there. The forest had finally given up its secret after 15 years. The truth had emerged. Justice had been served. Bridgeton could finally close a chapter that had remained painfully open for far too long. Detective Rachel Voss attended the memorial service, standing quietly toward the back of the gathering. She wasn't in uniform, just a member of the community, paying respects to a woman she'd never met, but had come to know intimately through evidence files and witness statements, and 3 months of relentless investigation. As candles flickered against the gathering darkness and musicians played their final notes, someone asked Voss what she'd learned from the Hargrove case. She considered the question carefully before answering. "Justice isn't always fast," she said, watching the candles reflect off the river's dark surface. "Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes new technology and dedicated people willing to spend hundreds of hours building family trees. But sometimes, if you're persistent enough, if you refuse to give up, justice eventually arrives. Not everyone gets that. Not every family gets answers. We're lucky we could give this to them." For the first time in 15 years, Bridgeton remembered Melissa Hargrove, not with the pain of unanswered questions, but with the peace that comes from knowing the truth. Her story had an ending now, not a happy ending. Those don't exist when someone's life is stolen, but a complete one, a truthful one. The candles burned until full darkness came, then were carefully extinguished. People embraced, shared memories, promised to keep Melissa's legacy alive through art, through stories, through refusing to let her be forgotten. The golden hour passed, night fell, and Melissa's memory remained, preserved like one of her watercolors, beautiful, meaningful, eternal. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a case. Share this video to honor Melissa's memory and to remind people that cold cases can be solved. Every share keeps these stories alive and brings awareness to families still waiting for answers. What case do you want me to cover next? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching, and remember, some questions take years to answer, but every person deserves to be remembered.